of the first group of 7 women admitted to study towards a degree in medicine at the University of Edinburgh in 1869. Janey takes us through how and why the women looking for a fair field and no favour were met with assertion from some professors and fellow students who resisted their right to be able to practice as doctors, a struggle including legal battles and court cases, and the women were eventually forced to leave without their degrees until they were ordered after their deaths. Janey is a graduate of Edinburgh University, where she studied English literature and language, as well as history of art, geography, sociology and philosophy. She's a trained English teacher at senior school level that has also developed a successful writing career, initially for children and now moving into multiple genres. So Janey's going to speak to us for about half an hour, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for questions. If everyone can think of those whilst Janey speaks, that would be great. Let's give her a big round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining me here today. I'm very passionate about the story of the Edinburgh Seven, and I have been since I discovered it only 4 years ago. So despite being a student at Edinburgh University in the 1980s, I had never heard about this, and I realised that I had a tutorial in the very building where they lived, and it really spoke to me very strongly, and I thought this story must travel far and wide, and it's a very important story, not just for our times, but for respect to the women. So I think one of the ways into the story is by looking at the protagonist and antagonist. So the heroine, if you like, of the story is Sophia Blake, and Sophia came to Edinburgh in 1869. It was her second time in Edinburgh, because she'd been here in 1862, just travelling and enjoyed it very much. But in 69, she comes to Edinburgh to schmooze with some professors of medicine, because she's decided during a tour of the United States that she wants to study medicine at a British university. Now, incredibly, that was impossible for women at that time. So there are a few professors who are actually quite welcoming and accommodating, and Sir James Young Simpson is the absolute hero. He was a very elderly man at the time. He died a year later, but he debated and campaigned for Sophia to be allowed to be on the course. So Sophia was extremely plucky. That is an understatement. She was bold, she was courageous, fearless, passionate, difficult in some ways, but she is someone that I have come to very much adore through the research on her, because she was the first person to say, this is not just for me, this is for all women here in 1869 and in the future. So that's really the powerful message of Sophia. But her journey in Edinburgh is very interrupted by some institutional misogyny. And the main proponent of that was Professor Robert Christison. He was staunchly against women coming into the medical profession for several reasons. Their brains were too small. They didn't have the stamina or the strength of character for such a difficult course. Imagine his surprise when, in the spring of 1870, one of our Edinburgh Seven, Edith Petchey, comes very first in chemistry across the whole year group of 200 with that very small brain. So these were tough times, because the more that the women did brilliantly at Edinburgh University, the more enraged and entrenched their opponents became. So before I go into the kind of episodes really of the Edinburgh campaign, as it's often called, just a word about why are they called the Edinburgh Seven, and who were they? So it starts with Sophia, and some of the professors say, yeah, definitely you're in. And then there's a senators meeting and a council meeting. It's, oh no, because how tricky it would be for just one woman. So Sophia thinks, haha, what I'll do is I will advertise in the Scotsman for more women. And that's how the Seven came about. And it's actually a Greek mythological reference to the Seven against Thebes. And it was the idea of 7 good champions against a cause that was maligning them. So the Edinburgh Seven then sort of gathered in Edinburgh for entrance exams around about 1869 into 70. And there were 4 and then 5 and then 7, and some were waiting for scholarships. It was expensive. They decided to charge the women an exorbitant amount because they were setting up special classes for them. So Sophia was actually a member of the Cubitt family who built most of Belgravia. So she went to the Bank of Mum, and it was going on back then too. And she said, you know, there are some other women and they don't have the means. And it was decided that Sophia's family would pay for several of the women, and there were scholarships for others. So in 1869, they actually matriculate. And by 1870, they're doing incredibly well. They're living together, not far from here, in 15 Buccleuch Place. And they've set up a very cool kind of commune with some of their kids. And I mean, there were various ages. Some of them had been midwives. All of them were interested in science. And I like to make the distinction that they were extremely respectful of nursing and midwifery, but they wanted to be surgeons, they wanted to prescribe, they wanted to do research and diagnose and become interested in what essentially has become the pharmaceutical industry. And those things were in the medicine degree course. So, in 1870, we have the first major stumbling block from the misogynists, which is called the Hope Scandal. There was a Hope Award laid down 40 years before by Professor Hope, and it was the first mark, the highest mark in chemistry would achieve the Hope Scholarship. So Edith, who is one of the band of 7, along with Sophia, she comes top in the class. Now, there is a discussion with Professor Robert Christison and Professor Crumb Brown, who is the chemistry master. And they think it would be very unwise for Edith to receive that award on the grounds that it was upsetting the men on the course. So Sophia and Isabel and Edith and Matilda and Mary and Helen, they realise at this point that maybe they're not actually going to be allowed to be in a fair field and no favour, which was what they had wanted, just pure equality. So they realise that the university might be blocking them from actually taking exams which would lead to a degree. And that was what they wanted to prevent now. They thought, oh, we've let them in, they're doing well, this is not what we expected, but they will never graduate and they will never be presented for all the exams. And they said to Sophia, don't worry, we're going to give you a label each time you complete a course. And Sophia famously said, I don't want your jam jar labels, I want a degree. Well, by the autumn of 1870, things have deteriorated hugely. The women are being name-called, vile and vulgar names in the street. Their house is being vandalised. They're being intimidated. They need a bodyguard by this point to move safely around this area in the city. And that was actually an Irish bodyguard. The Irish male medical students looked after them brilliantly. they're finding they're blocked from going into lectures, they're not allowed on the ward rounds, and you can't actually qualify as a medical doctor without being allowed on the wards. So this culminates in November of 1870. There's even an article in the university magazine saying that women are going to spoil the profession. Queen Victoria said this is an outrage that women think they can be equivalent to men in professions. There's a big movement in society which is regressive, and yet there is a kind of liberal Renaissance kind of vibe as well. So there was a great contradiction in the city. So what happens in 1870 is that they have an anatomy exam at Surgeons' Hall, which, if you know the city, is very close by. And it was the same building as now. That particular one had been there since 1832. And they were all prepared for it, and they went over and they felt that there was maybe going to be a problem. And indeed, when they arrived there was a violent riot ensuing to block them from the examination. There was drunkenness, there was pelting of them, there was name calling, there was a kind of cohort from the university of male students. There was in the wings some of the professors who were the misogynists. And there were also what Sophia called street rowdies as well. She's got a lovely turn of phrase in her diaries. So I think we know what she means by that. But this was a huge gathering by now. So it's easy to imagine turning round, going back to Buccleuch Place. It's a freezing November afternoon at 4 o'clock. And yet, they don't do that. They link arms and they inch their way through the mob towards the Surgeons' Hall. And this enrages the rioters further, and they try to block them. Their lives are certainly in danger at this point by all witness accounts, but they keep inching forward. And who is it out of this marvellous elite medical faculty who lets them into the exam? The janitor. And they go in there, there's further chaos because the faculty sheep, Mally, has been allowed to run riot in there to try and disturb things. But they very calmly take their exams, score the best marks. You'd think that this would be a point for the university misogynists to say, okay, we really need to be a bit more welcoming. The newspapers were saying things like, in an era where the societal norm is chivalry towards women, you should be ashamed of yourselves. And yet, what the university does is double down on their position. Now, I must stress that there were some marvellously supportive professors at the university, particularly David Masson and Dean Balfour of the faculty. But they were in an impossible position in a way because the more powerful people were not in favour. So after the riot, I think Sophia actually senses an opportunity. She was extremely modern and she was brilliant at PR. And she's friends by now with the editor of The Scotsman. And I think she realised, I should be seizing on this moment to gain more public support for our campaign. And she goes to talk on the 2nd of January 1871 at the City Chambers, and it's a meeting of the hospital, the Royal Infirmary. And she is allowed to speak because she's paid £5 to be on the board. This is all pre-NHS. So it was very interesting, I found. How was it funded? How were the prescriptions funded? How did people with no means ever get better? So that's for another day, but it's fascinating. So Sophia contributed to the board and was allowed to speak. And when she was speaking to say, you know, this is what we have encountered, she said, and this all culminated in this riot. And she goes on to say that it was instigated by Edward Cunningham Craig. And what's more, he was drunk. And Professor Christensen is there and he thinks, gotcha, slander, defamation, we'll take you to court. And a most gorgeous line of Sophia's is a bit later on. She said, if you prefer me to say that man was vile and violent and foul-mouthed while sober, I'm happy to do so. So by the June, they've got her in the Court of Session, in the dock. And the public gallery is full. And money is coming in to Sophia through checks from Boston, New York, the Sorbonne. Remember, all those places are already educating women as doctors, particularly Switzerland, Italy, France, the United States. So Sophia knows she has support. But when the public were allowed in, there were many comments of, gosh, they're wonderful women, they're eloquent, they're straightforward, because they've been so demonized by the university and the kind of right-wing press at the time. So the case goes on and Sophia's extremely bold under cross-examination. But even she has to admit that there is a legal hitch with her account, is that it is hearsay because she wasn't actually there when the riots started. She arrived when it was going. So someone told her it was Cunningham Craig, but she didn't see that. And that was enough to let the sort of slander accusation hold. However, the jury, remember all male juries until the 1930s or so. So you could be accusing a woman of all sorts of things, but there would be no women on the jury. The jury finds in favour of Cunningham Craig, but it's by a fraction of a penny that he is awarded damages, which in those days was tantamount to saying, we're not really happy with this. You know, we know what society expects of us as male jurors, however. And a lot of men started coming out after this saying, she has right on her side. And a lot of newspapers did. But the university further entrenches. And when I say the university, you know, it's about 6 or 8 people. Joseph Lister was very opposed to the women as well. And when they were being blocked from exams and so on, he was quoted as shouting, hurrah, hurrah. So after the court case, Sophia is exhausted and she is losing her way a little bit on her actual coursework, but she recognises that she's been asked to speak now in London. Remember, the railways have opened up the country for public speaking and so on. And Sophia is really a kind of celebrity activist by this stage. And by the autumn of 1871, 3 of the members of the group actually get married. And there's a feeling of we're losing our impetus a bit here. So Sophia turns her eyes to London and she talks to a politician called Lord Wedderburn. And she said, what we really need to do is change the law so that women who have the correct entrance examinations can have the same type of medical career and belong to the same medical organisations as men. She campaigns for this all the way through the 1870s, by 1873, they've had to leave Edinburgh without their degrees. This is heartbreaking. They love Edinburgh, they love the university, they love a vast majority of the professors. A few of them go to Bern in Switzerland, some go to the Sorbonne. 2 of them have children and simply cannot complete the degree in another city. But Sophia is tireless. She sets up a training hospital for women, a medical training hospital for women in London. She campaigns at Westminster. She goes off to Bern to finish her degree. They just quickly all learned German when they had to do things like that. No Google Translate. And she goes to Dublin for her qualifying exams. So the Victorian period was an era of establishing order among the professions, and nursing, midwifery and medicine were the same, and that's when you have things like the General Medical Council and so on. And the way to enter that was not just one route. So you would need to do your degree and then qualifying exams, and Dublin was very receptive to that. Just as a side note, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson had become the first British female doctor some years before by going through the Society of Apothecaries in London and finishing off at the Sorbonne. So these women in Edinburgh were the first ever at a university to be trying to achieve this. The law changes in favour of the women in 1876, and never one to let the grass grow. By 1878, Sophia's putting a plaque on her door at the West End of Edinburgh, at Manor Place, as Scotland's first female doctor. So she doesn't hold many grudges. She comes back to Edinburgh, or maybe it's a bit like, I'm back. And she is bossing it by now. And Christison is quite an elderly man, and he's enraged to hear of all this. And in fact, I read that his granddaughter wanted to study medicine, and he was thoroughly opposed to that as well. So it was something kind of religious in him. And I think we have to understand Edinburgh was a mix of the enlightened and the Calvinist hangover kind of religious group. So that was a lot to do with some of the misogyny. And it wasn't that Christison was a bad man to the women in his family or anything like that, I must stress. This was a cultural thing. It went back to the Roman spheres, whereby men could be city and state and politics, and women must stay in another sphere, which was domestic, home, the genteel arts. And the Victorian era embraced that. In the middle and upper classes, it's important to say that lots of women were working in very menial jobs, and several of them all through the Victorian era. But it does seem that there was some progress in Tudor and Georgian times, and then in the Victorian era, a lot of regression. So what happens after that, the legacy then of the Edinburgh Seven? Sophia sets up a training hospital for female medics over in Bruntsfield in the city, which was a hospital under the NHS till about the 1980s. Edith goes to India and starts the first women's hospital in Kama in India. Matilda goes to Japan and starts a midwifery school. The others have practices on Harley Street, in Marylebone in London. The 2 who don't have the time to fully qualify run the medical schools in London and Edinburgh. And the group of 7 stays very, very close. And every day I'm learning new things about this group. So when Edinburgh rejected them, there were multiple court cases, none as dramatic as the defamation case, but lots of Lord Ordinaries at the Court of Session saying, if you've allowed the women to matriculate, and that was the same type of matriculation as the men, they've got to graduate. And interestingly enough, the university bodies, about 4 of them, which, as Edith said, they all folded into the one thing because it was the same 6 guys. But those were able to actually overcome the judiciary of Scotland. And in these times, it was sometimes unclear where jurisdiction lay. And you would find examples of the university was always at war with the council, because the council actually thought it ran the university. And sometimes they would come and seize paperwork and everything. And the university said, no, we're running this place. And so the law wasn't actually always quite tight around these parameters. So Sophia meets her life partner in the second stage of her life in Edinburgh, Margaret Todd, who has written an excellent biography of Sophia, which proved to be very, very useful to me. The types of research I was doing were out-of-print biographies of some of the women. Mary and Matilda were much more shy, and I do mention them in the book. I give all of the women a chapter because I think without the group that the impact they made would not have happened. But lots and lots of archive material, newspaper articles, biographies, academic papers. But it's interesting, I was discussing with this lady here. We both went to Edinburgh. She's currently at Edinburgh in 3rd year. Yeah. And we don't know about this as students. And that goes for the 1980s and that goes for now. Now, to be fair to the university, they did a posthumous degree ceremony in 2019 for the women, and that was extremely touching. They had kind of modern day surrogates for each of the 7, and they were awarded degrees. And I think 2 things about that. One is that I think the pandemic kind of got in the way of that news a bit. But also I think that was the university sort of drawing a line under this uncomfortable story. And I understand that. However, I was at the university in February for a lunch, and I'm a great fan of Edinburgh University. I mean, this is historic, you know, I must be told. And we were all at circular tables, and it's in the Playfair Library at the university, which, if you've ever been, has all these busts, perhaps 100 busts of men. And I felt this kind of like heat burning on my face, and I looked up to the statue that was right there, and it said, Professor Robert Christison. And he was a very forbidding kind of Victorian gentleman, you know, with the stern face and the kind of lack of smile. But I thought, actually, although it's a bit uncomfortable, I have to tell this story. I've been on radio, I've been in lots of newspaper articles, because I find it staggering that it's not more widely known in Edinburgh and at Edinburgh University. Those women are my heroes. You know, question when Edinburgh would have really fully embraced women having degrees and so on without the Edinburgh Seven. And as I say, Edinburgh Seven forever. So I was going to read a little bit. I'm not sure how our time's going.
It's probably a couple more minutes.
Couple of more minutes, okay. Not long sections, but just a little bit to contextualize the world that Sophia found herself in. It was a man's world at this time. It's impossible to overestimate the combined interests of professional men in the Edinburgh establishment of this period. The new club in Edinburgh, for men only of course, at this time had moved to its current site on Princes Street and proved a popular meeting place for men in the upper echelons of society, a place where loyalties were forged, deals were struck, and political decisions were formed. A world within a world to which women had no access. So if you could imagine the powerlessness of being clever, being confident, being interested in a particular career, and it being completely close to you, and not only that, you're vilified for wanting to do it. And later on in the book, Sophia was born into a man's world, one of obstacles, challenges, entrenched positions, and plentiful opponents. But she and her Edinburgh associates did an excellent job of opening up the professions for women at a time when medicine, the law, the church, education, finance, and politics were largely male preserves. What a triumph then to be a driving force in the process of medical education for women. Thank you. So, questions?
Yeah, we've got about
10 or 15 minutes. If you have any questions.
Janey, if you could repeat the question into the microphone, that would be
I will do. Okay.
yeah, let's start.
Okay.
Hi, so I was just wondering if you had an idea of why the UK was already so far behind. So you talked about Switzerland and France and places. Why? What was it that was peculiar about the UK that we needed this?
Yeah. So the question is, why was the UK so far behind at this point compared to America and Europe, and why did we need a campaign like this at all? My understanding is that, so it was UK-wide, so it wasn't just Edinburgh. In fact, Edinburgh was the only one out of 8 universities to even entertain this. I think that there was a real thing going on, in my opinion, with the Victorian royal family. So they'd had a licentious period with the Georges and the Regency, and they did this incredibly regressive women in the home, angel in the home, but it was okay for the Queen to be a Queen Empress, of course. And society was actually going a bit backwards in the UK at that sort of mid-Victorian period, and I think that that was one of the things that we were battling, a kind of societal norms had swung away a bit from women's rights. Any other questions? Yes?
So I was curious how, because presumably this movement would have been picked up by, other burgeoning feminist movements at the time. Presumably there was a sort of burgeoning suffragist movement and things like that. So how did this story fit into to that whole sort of the larger feminist movement at the time?
Okay, so the question is, how did the Edinburgh campaign fit into the larger suffrage and feminist movement of the period? All of the women considered themselves as, part of the suffrage, the female suffrage. Mostly there was no conflict. Occasionally you would find that key members of the suffrage movement would not entirely agree with certain aspects of the campaign, but mostly they were getting big, big support, and that's where the money was coming in from other activists. And interestingly, those feminist activists had often been abolitionists. So, and this is where I had a delightful week where this crossed over with Little Women in my research. But, you know, by being a family or a person who had objected to enslavement of people, you were then naturally drawn to the female suffrage. So they were all part of a solidarity, but the Edinburgh Seven was its own thing as well. Any further questions?
Yeah, I was just going to ask what the response from the university's been to your book.
So the question is, what's been the response from the university to my book? Well, in many ways, very fair. I do not expect them to help me promote this book, and nor are they helping me promote this book. I think that they feel they've done enough. There is a plaque at Surgeons' Hall which said there was a riot here in 1870, the Edinburgh Seven. But it doesn't actually say what happened. You go inside Surgeons' Hall into the museum. Now, I really do not exaggerate. There is about this size of information about the Edinburgh Seven. There is a plaque in the medical school, but by and large, and I have a sympathy with this, they have a lot of current unrest amongst the student body with all kinds of things that are going on in modern society. And I think that they're not, they have a group that keeps this story alive, but they don't really want to be actively associated with it on a regular basis. So they haven't blocked me in any way from talking about it. Anything else? Diplomatic. Any further questions? So at the back and then Carrie. Mm-hmm.
Not a question, but there is a thing in like the library of the university, I think, that's about them. I haven't looked at it in about 4 years, so it might not still be there.
Okay.
And I might be remembering it wrong, but I feel like at the time it said that they didn't graduate, and it never quite said why. It made it seem like they weren't able to graduate, like they were unsuccessful in trying to achieve a degree, as opposed to have maybe had obstacles in every step. But I think there is something in the university central library.
Yeah. So someone is just commenting that there is something about them in the university central library, and that in fact it's ambiguous in its wording, and that's the case in a lot of this. I've even heard it said that the court insisted the women left the university, which really isn't the case. The court actually found in favour of the women, but it was a Pyrrhic victory because, in fact, the university wouldn't have them. But that's interesting. And in St Giles Cathedral, there's a really nice plaque to Sophia, but I've never got to the bottom of who placed that there, so I would be interested to know that. Harry?
I wanted to ask, I mean, you're known for writing, fiction for all ages. How easy was it to go into an area of non-fiction where there was always a demand to be really accurate, but also to be doing that in your own city? And is that you saying you're going to do more non-fiction?
So the question is, how was it moving from writing fiction to non-fiction, and the demand to be accurate in my own city, and will I be doing more? well, I felt the weight of the world upon me in my research phase. The terrifying thing is to ever cut and paste something into your document that isn't your words but gets assimilated. So as soon as you cut and paste, you have to highlight that. It's a very, very strict process. But I was quite of the opinion that I would use my fiction skills not to invent things but to make it more than a dry account. So I think that the previous skills have all come to bear on the book. I've enjoyed it hugely. I believe, and I'm saying this because they might be here today, but I believe there's someone in the city who's an expert on Sophia Blake. It's now sounding like the plot of a novel in itself. And she has reviewed the book very, very highly. So that was a moment of great relief, because not everybody is going to know if page 41 is accurate. But I was very careful, so I went through what I'd call triple checking of dates, facts, people. I would try to corroborate with 3 primary sources. So it's not enough just that some newspaper of the day said it. Let's see if a biographer has anything new on that. Let's see if one of the diaries or something in the archives, or a letter. Only the other day I found a letter from Sophia to St Andrews University asking if they could go there when Edinburgh rejected them. And it was signed by 15 women. So that was, over the 2 to 3 years they were here, they grew to be 15. So those kind of primary sources are just great finds, and it's very exciting. But this particular letter had been unlisted and found tucked away until 2012. Mm-hmm. And will I do more nonfiction? Yes. Oh.
Are there any more questions?
I think we have one more.
Could I
Make
make
that the last one.
Yes.
Sorry, I feel bad because I've already asked one, but you were talking very much about women demanding to be treated with equality with men, but was there any discussion around the proactive argument that for women's health, for medicine in general to become better, it required females to be involved?
That's a great question. The question is, were any of the arguments along the lines that it was actually better for women's health if there were female doctors? Yes. This was something that was used a lot in discussion. If you think of how private Victorian women were at the time, they would often not go to a doctor with ailments and illnesses because of embarrassment. It seems to me, and this would be another great area of research, but until quite recently there was a feeling that you'd brought illness upon yourself, which I certainly don't subscribe to, but that women did feel ashamed, and all the childbirth stuff, the postnatal depressions. As soon as you had women doctors who had done some of that, to do with menstruation and all the rest of it, then the care of women hugely improved. So yes, they did use that argument. And in fact, there was an amazing meeting where one woman said something along the lines of to the doctors, they were saying, we don't want women with us when we're examining male bodies, and somebody said, well, how do you think we feel when you're examining us? So a lot of the arguments were very spurious, and I think it's true that it's been good for women's health to have women doctors. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. Let's give Janey a big round.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
We've got some books available to buy, and then if we move into that room, Janey, do you want to sign some?
Yes.
Just so we can get this room back together. So
I see.
drift
Okay.
slowly over there.
All right.